Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Dr. Andrew Wilson.
Yes, good day, Graeme, and good to be here again this week. Big week in property news, not so much in terms of the data that's come through, although we have some fresh data, which is interesting today. But, we've now got a new Reserve Bank Governor. So, and it's the first female to take the role. So I guess that's a good thing. But whether it'll produce any different results, that's a question, or whether the process will be different. I guess that's the acid test. But today we'll have a look back and see some of those issues which have, I really think, let's be frank here, sully the reputation of the bank and the previous governor, who's now looking for another position.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to put a dampener on the parade for the, I think it is great, and female RBA governor, that's awesome, but I don't want to put a dampener on the parade. But too little, too late. It's kind of like, well, we're screwed if we do, and we're screwed if we don't. We may as well. The old story: something has to change, or something will change. So if we control the change, we control the narrative, right? So let's change it now and not wait till we have to change it. But I think she's got a pretty tough job ahead of her based on what they've been doing historically.
Well, I think all reserve banks have tough jobs, Graeme, because, economics is something that's almost perpetually in a state of flux because things change that we can't foretell. I do think that they can do things better. And a lot of economists tend to think that this is an absolute science, economics, but it's not, particularly over the medium term. We've seen, the textbooks really been thrown out the window over the last few years because monetary policy hasn't had the impact that it was supposed to have when we were trying to, stimulate our economy with lower interest rates. It didn't work. Now we're trying to ease economic activity, to bring down inflation. It's not really working, in terms of what the policy is doing. I mean, we are getting lower inflation, but it's probably would have happened anyway, regardless of interest rates.
I had a chuckle on the weekend, Doc, as I was had a rare day off and I was coming back from Bunnings and I heard the treasurer on the radio in the car. And I tell you what, there was plenty of people at Bunnings spending money, mind you, on building stuff and sausage sandwiches. And he's like, we are throwing every page of the textbook at this policy-wise. And I'm thinking, isn't that maybe part of the problem, that we're still relying on textbooks from ye old when the world has changed?
Yeah, it has, Graeme, and that's the problem, that the infrastructure of economics is very much fixed on, what they read in their textbooks, which reflects previous periods of economic activity. And as we can see, it's always changing, and the policy reactions to that change don't. And the problem is, you just start to become a backward looking entity when you're trying to fix things as they're happening in real time, and things change. Now, look, this is very difficult. I understand that. You can't be experimental, in terms of your policy positions if you're in charge of, the financial sector and the economics of the country. You have to have some sort of a plan, and that plan has to come from some legitimacy. And that, of course, is what's happened previously. But as we know, that doesn't hold water because things are changing all the time. And just because we fixed inflation, did we? Well, we did in the early 90s and the early 80s, doesn't mean we can use the same toolkit to do it now. And then it won't have different consequences. Now, as I said, you can't blame the economists to some degree because they need to have a platform, a reason for what they're doing things. But that doesn't mean that they're not getting it wrong. And I believe, and I have been a critic of this current Reserve Bank, or the previous one, whichever way you want to put it, for a number of years. And we'll look at that in some depth, at what I believe were the mistakes that the Reserve Bank made. And I'm not sure reporting less and talking to the media more is going to make any difference to the actual policy. This comes from the top down. I mean, the treasurer, whatever his background is really no expert at high level monetary policy. And he's probably not really there to be one. but he has to rely upon the experts in the field, and of course that's the Reserve Bank. And they've been really battered from pillar to post in terms of their reputation. And we'll look at the reasons why, the mistakes that they did make. And I think some of them are fundamental mistakes that they could have avoided. But going forward now, that it's up to them to, be perhaps a little bit more precise in terms of their of what they do and how they report it and present it. Because I think that was the problem that we've seen. And I think even recently we've seen some really questionable decisions which didn't follow the actual rhetoric, the actual commentary of the Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
They were saying one thing and then they were doing another thing. You know what I mean? It was,
Look over here.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right. Yeah. That's
dear. Well, let's actually have a look at the data, Doc, rather than look over there or over there. Let's
like
into some of the.
It's very good. But I think it's a very I think it's very good. Okay, so the data this week says, as we've just discussed, we have a new RBA governor. It's the first female in the role. She has been the deputy governor. She was actually appointed by the previous administration, so there's no sort of it's a friend of the political party of the government, the current government. And she has been the deputy governor for some time, not a long time, but prior to that, she was taking up other positions, had other positions outside the Reserve Bank. But the big picture is, I think, that she's had 38 years with the Reserve Bank. So she's not exactly an outsider, Graeme. She's very, very much an insider. And of course, really, if you think about it, she must have had some input to the decisions that have caused a lot of anxiety or certainly questions to be asked over the last couple of years. She was there.
Yeah.
She got a vote. So like I said, it's a bit same old, really. It's just, moving the chairs on the Titanic, dare I say it, but not really the Titanic. So she's very much an insider and has been part of the process over the last couple of years in terms of decision making. And I don't think Philip Lowe, or maybe he was the single voice, in charge of it all. So a new RBA governor. Of course, it's not just having a new governor and a female. It's also the structure of the Reserve Bank going forward has been changed from next year. I think we're only having 8 reporting periods, so instead of every month, except January, we're going to have eight decisions. And there has to be which I don't understand what the difference there is. I mean, what happens if something comes out of left field? What do you do? Oh, sorry, we can't report for another 2 months because they're the Labor Party rules. Okay. And the other point is that there has to be a press conference, where the governor is grilled by the media in terms of the latest decision. Not sure that's great either. Nothing wrong with, of course, reporting these things, but as we've discussed, these decisions are, highly volatile. Economics is not a precise science, and sometimes it can be difficult to try to explain things at any level in terms of decision making. And the trap there is you'll start making forecasts because that's what the media wants. And we know that's where Philip Lowe has had his biggest problems, was with his, forecasts, which all proved to be, dare I say it, completely and utterly wrong. And
there's a bit of buyer beware danger here, Doc, because a lot of financial spending habits and patterns and family, there's a lot of psychology that people don't understand or don't realize attached to buying, not buying, moving, new cars, new homes. And this can be a two-edged sword here, or as you like to say, the law of unintended consequences, because mum and dad don't go looking for the minutes of the Reserve Bank meeting at the moment, right? They hear what they want to hear on the news. You now start seeing the Reserve Bank governor in the media, and the media grabbing one little comment and clipping that, going, spend away, or we're going to hit a recession, or each family at home listening to this on the idiot box is going to interpret this psychologically differently without the context, perhaps. this could really slow spending and inflation. It could really put us through the roof and give a false sense of security. This is dangerous. I don't know. This is uncharted territory.
Well, I think the question, if you're in the media, you can say, okay, well, this is the decision. What are we going to be doing next year? They'll ask for that. Now, what do you say? I don't know. Well, we don't want to say that because that doesn't build confidence. Or I think we might be here, or I think we might be there. Whichever way you answer it, you sort of look like you're not in control of the situation and you don't know what the future holds. Well, hello, we don't know what the future holds, but that's the sort of headline that the media would be looking for. Well, what does the future hold? And as I said, this is a fertile ground for unintended misinformation, which can have, as you said, unintended consequences in terms of how the media respond to it and how the public respond to what the media puts out there as being, the salient points from the press conference. This is just following what the US does. I mean, I don't know why we're sort of sitting back going, we're starting this whole new system now, when basically we've just cut and pasted from what they do in the US. Which I think's a little, I'm not sure I feel comfortable that we should just follow the US policy position, which has, again, it's a different country. It has a different setup. And different drivers, although the big picture's the same. Inflation's too high. We've got to use interest rates to push it down. But as I say, I think all we've done here is just copy what the US do. And we know that, the US media is virulent and rampant. And, I guess we're the same and just searching for a quick headline. And that's, like I said, fertile ground for misinformation because you don't, as you said, Graeme, you don't have the full context. And the new governor will certainly be under pressure to answer questions because if you don't, you look like you're prevaricating, that you're a bit oily, and people just don't understand the difficulties that are involved with economic policy making and forecasting, and this is why we are where we are. And governments are in a short-term 3-year electoral cycle. Graeme, what do they care going forward? They're looking to be, hey, look what we've done. We've changed this. We've got a new female governor, first ever. We've got all these new rules. It's just like the US, and this will make things different. It won't make any difference at all, Graeme, because we still have to follow the guidelines. We still have to have a roadmap for decision-making in economics, and that really is the past. And as we've seen, the past is not a good indication of the future, particularly in terms of economic forecasting. So we've got a new governor, Graeme. Let's have a look at, and as I mentioned there, the governor is certainly a long-term RBA insider. It's a feel-good appointment. Let's be clear. It's the first female governor of the Reserve Bank, and certainly Philip Lowe has paid for what I believe has been the RBA incompetence, and I use that word advisedly, over the past near decade. And I've always said, Graeme, and we've discussed this, that I think the RBA has had a misplaced obsession almost with the housing market. I think that they've looked too closely at the housing market. And just interesting, and I'm not saying this in any terms of being a relationship, but I thought it was interesting in terms of the financial statement the new governor made that she has quite a robust investment portfolio, Graeme. She's been very, very active with investment properties, which, good on her. And that's no different from a lot of other Australians. And I suppose if you're earning a big wage, you want to spread your investment profile. But and I think Philip Lowe's also has quite a reasonable investment property portfolio. So, but I'm not suggesting
when you get those. No, but especially when you get those Reserve Bank home loan rates, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think Mr. Lowe Dr. Lowe took advantage of that for one of his properties. I think it's a 50% discount in terms of the rate. So, building wealth through property, but we know all about that, of course. But I do think notwithstanding that, and it probably hasn't been a reflection of their connection with their investment portfolio, but that housing market obsession. I think Philip Lowe's been, part of that. I believe he did his PhD in asset bubbles. Perhaps he's been searching for an asset bubble, over the journey, and perhaps
it'd be nice to put his PhD into practice, right? It's just never happened.
Well, you can tend to fall in love with your PhD, Graeme. I used to be a supervisor for PhD students, so I was always very mindful of maintaining the objectivity, not just in their research outcomes, but post-research in terms of how they apply their particular field of interest to their later lives and careers. But I think he's been perhaps, quite happy to continue to search for asset bubbles. As we know, asset bubbles, particularly in the property market, are a little bit like the Yeti or abominable snowman, Graeme. Everybody seems to believe in them, but nobody's produced one yet. I'm not sure. Have you seen one recently? But it is a little bit like that, the housing market bubble. And, we get a lot of people dressed up as abominable snowmen trying to pass themselves off, but perhaps that's what we've seen in terms of, these house price bubbles that are supposed to occur or are always there, but we never really see them. But so it can be, I guess, if you're a believer in that, you're just searching for them. And, I'm not suggesting it hasn't had a direct input, but we have to look at some issues regarding the housing market, and where I believe what was a negative for Philip Lowe and the Reserve Bank. And I think it started way back in 2015, 2000 through to 2018, Graeme, and we speak almost relentlessly about this. But we did see APRA, the banking sector regulator. They're in charge of risk managing the banks. It actually followed this policy. They introduced a policy of what's called macro-prudential control. It did come out of our brethren in New Zealand, or our comrades in New Zealand. New Zealand Reserve Bank introduced this policy of trying to control the housing market by differentiating the flow of credit to investors. At the time, the New Zealand Reserve Bank was concerned there weren't enough first-home buyers in the market. There were too many investors, so they thought if they made it harder for investors to be in the market, then we'd get more first-home buyers. Sounds simple, doesn't it? And I think simple's the word really to describe that policy. And of course, let's be clear that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has now experiencing a recession in New Zealand, and that they've quite clearly said that they will not be touching interest rates for the foreseeable future, because they went a little bit overboard, perhaps. So if you think there are question marks about the Australian Reserve Bank, there are even bigger question marks about the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And as I said, that New Zealand is now in a recession, and their housing market is in an awful state still, with first home buyer numbers, continuing to be very low. And I think that was one of the reasons why they decided to, move with a new Prime Minister, the New Zealand Labor Party, and Jacinta was, moved to exit stage right. And that was one of the policy failures, was to try to get more first-home buyers in the New Zealand housing market, which has been a clear failure. And that, I believe, works its way back to, to some degree, those macro-prudential policies that came out of New Zealand. We followed them, Graeme. APRA created a credit squeeze through the banking sector on investors. At the time, the RBA, Treasury, ASIC, all of them were cheering along, oh, this great new policy, it's going to be great. We're going to have more first home buyers in the market, and fewer investors. We'll get more balance. Well, and of course, it was in a period where the rationale behind this was that interest rates were going to rise. So they said, oh, look, we're doing this because we believe interest rates are going to rise in the foreseeable future, and that will put stress on our housing markets, particularly investors who are more highly geared and perhaps don't have the same capacity to survive higher interest rates. So we're going to make sure we've got fewer investors, and certainly fewer more highly geared investors. So that was the plan, Graeme. And as I said, the Reserve Bank was right behind the APRA policy credit squeeze on banks. And APRA, they're not policy makers. They're just there to help, banks manage their risk. And of course, if rates are going to go higher, maybe that does mean there is more risk, and maybe in those more highly geared parts of the housing market, such as the investment market. So, okay, that's understandable. But as I said, the RBA was right behind it. And of course, what we've seen really up until perhaps just a year ago, a continued credit squeeze on investors, Graeme. And really, the poor old investor's been kicked from pillar to post by all types of governments. And now, we don't have the elephant in the room is we don't have any investment properties left, and rents are, crippling tenants right across Australia virtually now because of that lack of investment property. And we're still blaming the investor, whereas, it's about the lack of investors, not too many investors that's causing this issue. But so that was the first issue. I think the Reserve Bank was a little bit too closely aligned with those, and they were looking at it obviously in terms of managing the banking sector, but they got it wrong because they were predicting, Graeme, through that period of 2017-18 particularly, that the next move in interest rates would be up. Now, they kept rates, if you remember, Graeme, back there, we had a period of a lengthy period, in fact, a record period where rates were kept on hold. And there was a lot of criticism at the time of why are you leaving rates on hold? And I think this was all part of that APRA risk management rates are going to rise type of environment, because they didn't want to cut rates because that would, they thought it would stimulate the housing market again, right? And they were kept predicting that rates would rise. The next move in rates would be up. They kept telling us that every month, Graeme, back then, 2018, that the next move in rates would be up. And there's been some research, Graeme, which I think is interesting, done, that the fact that they kept rates on hold at higher levels, really, when other jurisdictions had zero interest rates, we kept our rates higher and on hold for a lengthy period of time, despite the fact that we had like 1% inflation and an underperforming labour market and an underperforming economy. I, at the time, railed against this, saying you've got to cut rates because, the economy is suffering. Now, there's been some research done that revealed that hundreds of thousands of jobs were actually lost because of the rates being held too high for too long. They admit that now, and of course, the offset to all of that, embarrassingly, I suppose, was that finally, at the second half of 2019, they realised they were wrong and they slashed rates 3 times at the back end of 2019. So, that's sort of the reverse of what we've seen recently in terms of rates. They were predicting higher rates and we got lower rates. And of course, then we've had the COVID experience where, of course, inflation was generated through it. And of course, the Reserve Bank, as many have said, did a good job in terms of managing the economy through that crisis, the COVID crisis. But, Graeme, they just did what everybody else did. There was nothing different here than what the US were doing and all other central banks were doing: slash interest rates, flood the economy with money, right? And support, the state government's capacity to spend. But, of course, then we got the inflation, which was, I guess, reasonably predictable, although they didn't predict it. But once we sort of moved into that, inflation's rising, we had this again from the governor telling us that the next rise in interest rates wouldn't be until 2024. And he was saying that every month, the next rise in interest rates won't be till 2024. And of course, we know that rates actually ended up rising in May 2022. So those predictions were, again, well off the mark. And I think that was the sort of the final nail, for the Reserve Bank in terms of, its competence. People started to really question the Reserve Bank. And I don't think the Reserve Bank should be in the media eye. It should be really a background, operation. And now we've got this one where it's going to be presented front and centre to the media, every couple of months. So, no rate rise until 2024. That's embarrassing because it didn't happen. And of course, the other thing is that generally, not just in terms of interest rates, Graeme, but the Reserve Bank has a very poor record on its forecasting anyway. We know that, and I was horrified when it was forecasting. It actually forecast house prices, Graeme. What business has the Reserve Bank got really in something that can be volatile, forecasting house price outcomes? And it embarrassingly recently had to back off, as most of those that have forecast doom and gloom in the housing market, again, have had to look, that they were wrong. But to have the Reserve Bank saying, yeah, we were wrong, and their excuses for why they got it wrong were just ridiculous, because they were saying, oh, well, population growth. Well, we all knew that once borders were open, we were going to get a surge in population. And then they said, higher wages have helped offset higher interest rates. Well, they were wrong on their wages because they were predicting higher wages than we actually got anyway. So it was just looked very embarrassing to try to use that as what was clearly not the reason they got it wrong on house price forecasts. And again, they were predicting sharp falls for this year. You would have thought the Reserve Bank, given their obsession with the housing market, in my opinion, would be a little bit more circumspect about their forecasts and have a little bit more, focus on the historical environment. Because as we've often said, Graeme, we've only had 4 falls in house prices since 1987, 5 falls since 1987, annual house price falls. And the worst was 5.5% in 2018. So I don't know where all these crazy 10, 20, 30% forecasts are coming from. That has absolutely no historical evidence to support it. But they were also wrong on wages in terms of wages growth. They had all these so-called inside data connections that were telling them, that this was going to happen. And it never happened. They were wrong. And in terms of the labour market as well. And I think the final thing, Graeme, is for me, is that, there's been a lot of inconsistency in their decisions as revealed in their commentary, right? It was, when we saw the June result where we saw interest rates increase, and we saw the commentary there said it was a very close decision, right? And yet over June, they increased interest rates over June, which was reasonably predictable because and they keep telling us, well, we just rely on the data, and the data was stronger. And yet they paused interest rates over April when the data was strong, and they increased interest rates when the data was weaker over May. So what I'm saying is that the data is weak, and yet we get a pause, and the data is strong, and yet we get an increase. Sorry, the other way around. The data's weak, and we get an increase, and the data is strong and we get a pause. So it doesn't follow the logic that you should be raising rates if the data is strong, and you should be pausing rates if the data is weak, because you want weak data, right? You don't want strong data. And yet it seemed to me almost that June decision, which they said was close, right, that they sort of said, okay, well, half of you people want to rise, half of you people want to pause. We'll go with the rise this month, and then we'll give you the pause next month, because the data prior to July, the main data that we were getting was very strong, low unemployment rates, retail sales rising again, and yet they decided to pause rates. I just can't see the logic here if they're saying we're going to rely on the data as it's coming through, and the data coming through doesn't reflect the decision. Strong data, and yet we had a pause. It's all over the shop, Graeme, and I think this is, again, why we're seeing such a significant change in the Reserve Bank, not just the new governor, but, the structure of the Reserve Bank going forward. So I know I've probably been ranting and raving, but I think this is our chance to do it, and hopefully we can get a better outcome going forward. But I do believe that, we've just got to stop this ridiculous, and hopefully it'll happen, focus on the housing market from the Reserve Bank. Particularly when they keep getting it wrong. If they were on the money, fair enough, but they keep getting it wrong.
I can hear Disney's Frozen in the background. Let it go. I think the RBA just need to let it go when trying to forecast and tinker and assume what's going to happen in the housing market. Just get on with it, guys. Let it go.
Well, we hope that the new governor will resist the temptation to be doing forward forecasting of what's they believe will happen, because that's got danger written all over it. It's quicksand, and she's going to have to get some really good media training, I think, to be able to come up with the right persona and the right responses to what will be, and they will look at all these previous issues that the previous governors had to confront, such as the forecasting on rates, which were so wrong. And they'll be looking for forecasts, Graeme, and you just can't give them. You certainly just can't give them, because it's a signal to the market. And I think that's the big mistake that Reserve Bank governors are making. The US is a classic example. And it's driven by the need for the media to be able to come up, with a headline going forward. So we'll see what happens. And I think that, also a lot of the talk I've seen in regard to the Reserve Bank is that, hey, we've conquered inflation, where the inflation problem's behind us. Really? Where are you getting that from, people? I mean, the headline inflation's fallen basically in line with the price of oil, and now
funny that.
We've still got, which wouldn't have changed regardless of interest rates, but now we've got certainly goods, services inflation is rising. Goods inflation is easing because all those supply line constraints have been fixed or are being fixed. But, we're getting the wages, prices sort of spiral environment evolving. Strong economies, higher prices, inflation. But underlying inflation, Graeme, which is the measure the Reserve Bank uses, is still at 6.5%. And yet the target's 3%. So where's the victory, mate? We're still miles away from getting to that 2 to 3% target, which, they might have to change their target. I hope not. But and they're still saying that's years away to get back to 3%. So I don't know where all this nonsense is coming from, that we've, the Reserve Bank's lucky because the new governor's lucky because we've beaten inflation. Come on, that's doesn't reflect what the data is. So that's my 2 bobs worth, mate, or 10 cents worth.
I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that indeed. Yeah,
but
very much so.
Let's get back to the nitty gritty of the market. And what we do, Graeme, here uniquely is we, as well as giving our full month house price data, we also do a mid-month update. So we're presenting a mid-month update today, which we are in the middle of the month, for July. Now, this is the July quarter data, so it covers July, June and May. So it's a rolling quarterly data set, so there's plenty of observations, but we can see changes as it evolves on that month-to-month basis. No surprise, Graeme, that we're continuing to report strengthening results. Home prices were up again over the July quarter to date, and increasing now over 6 consecutive months. So we've had 6 months of rising national house prices. But the rate of growth has declined slightly, which perhaps reflects the emergence of that quieter winter selling season. We've seen a bit of up and down from clearance rates, and now it's been reflected not in terms of price declines, but prices aren't rising as quickly. And we know, Graeme, in winter, we see a much lower proportion of higher priced properties in the market because that demographic tends to be on holidays and tends also to be thinking about, or starting to think about, an end of the year selling campaign. And that evolves as the spring selling season. So let's have a look at the trend. Look at that, Graeme. That's a real U shape, isn't it? When we were talking about, is it going to be a V or a U or a W? Yeah. That's just... I
remember the statement, Doc. We kept saying this little correction won't be as deep or as steep as anyone is predicting. And look at that.
Look at that, mate. There we go. Up she went and up she goes. So
can we call it now and say that we were right?
Well, we don't want to sound arrogant or Marty pants, do we? But
no, we just want to be correct.
Well, it is what it is, mate. So when we've been making our forecasts, and we've been making them for a while now.
Last couple of years now, yeah.
And here we go again. And it's perhaps comforting at some level that we got it right, and did everybody else get it wrong?
Doc, several months, actually maybe 6 to 12 months ago, coming through COVID, you made a comment that's really stuck with me, and you said, Graeme, when interest rates go up, that's meant to slow the market down. That stagnation, you said to me, when things settle,
Yeah.
it goes up several times, 4 or 5 times faster when consumer confidence comes back.
Yes.
Now, when I look at that drop from July, August, but then when I look at that slight dipping August, September, October, but now I look at the growth rate. That growth rate is exactly as you suggested 6 to 12 months ago. It is much higher and quicker, its growth rate, than its decline was.
And that's the pent-up demand being released that we created through the tough times of a year ago when rates were rising, when all that negativity was around, buyers and sellers sat on their hands. And once things started to become a little clearer, once we got used to higher interest rates, once we realised, what a great economy we're involved in here, our wages are going through the roof, plenty of work around, people moved on and started thinking about, those postponed buying and selling decisions. And we saw it. It started to change in September last year. Yeah, prices were still falling, Graeme, but the rate of decline started to ease and auction clearance rates started to rise. It was almost inevitable, given our chronically undersupplied housing market, and the surging demand, particularly through migration, that we would see growth occurring again. And you can see that. We've had, we're now in the position of having as many declines, in a sense, as we've had many increases as we've had declines. And certainly that's our prospect this year. And that's, what we always see, that strong revivals following modest declines. So let's have a look at the individual capitals, Graeme. As I said, the growth rates weren't quite as strong over July. This is to the middle of July, so we'll certainly have an update in 2 weeks' time for the full month, because observations keep coming through and that improves the data, but it won't be a lot different. So Sydney up 0.6% over the month, Melbourne up 0.3%. It was really only Hobart, which has been weakening a little bit, but coming from a higher base last year that was down over the month. Brisbane up 1% over the month. I think the full year data, or the year to date, Graeme, is very instructive. Sydney house prices have increased nearly 8% so far this year. So nearly 8%, Graeme. It's now actually exceeding what our forecasts were, but they were mid-range forecasts. But I think Sydney's, must be on track for a 10% growth plus this year. Now, I'm saying plus 10% growth plus this year, which is just spectacularly different to all the predictions, which were just ridiculous. Now, over the past year, Sydney house prices are now tracking higher than where they were a year ago, Graeme. So Sydney house prices are now higher than where they were a year ago. And what I've introduced here as a little bit of an extra data set, which we will do, which I think helps us understand the value equation, is that Sydney's house prices are just 2.9% lower than their previous peak. So there's still some catch up to do. There's still value in the market for buyers, but certainly declining rapidly, that value opportunity and that value equation. So, Perth is interesting as well, Graeme. You can see Perth is up by 6.1% over the year, but Perth's actually 5.5% higher than its previous peak. So that's been so it's at record levels now, the Perth market. As I said, we're getting back very quickly to the previous peaks. Perth and Adelaide are above their previous peaks, but the other markets are closing in very quickly on their previous peaks, which typically were at the peak of the boom at the beginning of last year. So similar results for units there, Graeme, also rising, not quite as strong as recent quarters, but we'll see with the final data what happens there. Again, we're seeing most capitals' unit prices rising. Brisbane up 1.4%. That market is certainly a very robust unit market, Southeast Queensland, Graeme, 1.4% over the month, 5.8% over the quarter, this year so far. And over the past year, Brisbane unit prices still up 9.4%, and they are at record high levels. So Brisbane and Adelaide are certainly performing very strongly with the unit markets, Graeme. So we can finish off now with our auction update. We're post-holidays, so, have we all got the post-holiday blues? No, I'm not sure about that, but school holidays are back. We had some mixed results, but generally still very strong results in the big capitals, which has been a bit of a surprise, Graeme, how Melbourne and Sydney particularly have stood up over the past few weekends with the winter hiatus, really not slowing those markets down. So Sydney 74.3%. Again, a big lift in auctions, which is no surprise given the end of school holidays. Melbourne 79.1%, Graeme, clearance rate, which is the highest clearance rate this year so far for Melbourne. Again, more auctions there. Brisbane down a little bit. Brisbane's starting to look like the old Brisbane now with those 50% style clearance rates. Adelaide back up in the 80s and Canberra down again. But Melbourne and Sydney are really chugging along through winter at the moment, despite the fact, as we said earlier, that there is a differentiation in the stock types in the market in Melbourne and Sydney, particularly at the moment, where we have a much higher proportion of lower priced and mid-priced properties versus higher priced properties because, of course, of the holiday impacts. Still very active in higher priced regions where there's not a lot of action happening. We'll expect that to revive in come September when we'll see higher proportion of, or back to a normal proportion of higher priced properties. But it does show that there's plenty of interest in budget prices, budget price properties in Sydney and Melbourne, Graeme. And I think that's buyers who are looking for some value in the marketplace. So the trends there down a little bit through winter, but still quite high in Sydney, similar in Melbourne. Brisbane falling away a little bit over July so far. Adelaide, as usual, up amongst the 80s, and Canberra just falling away as well. But I think more of the midwinter holiday market affecting Canberra. So next week we're going to have a look at the June labour force figures. What's the unemployment rate for June? That's released this week, so we'll go through that in some depth. And, of course, the latest auction results. And that's me, Graeme.
Well, look forward to it, Doc. Thank you as always. And for those of you who have been tuning in and hearing about the app, as directed, most of you, in our private Facebook community group for our clients and community, the password is in there. I know a lot of you are enjoying that and thanking Doc in the private group. If you haven't logged in, log in, private group, you'll see the password. And we shall see you next week, Doc.
Absolutely, Graeme. Looking forward to those labour market results, and they will play their way into the next decision from the Reserve Bank. Let's hope we can, make some sense out of it this time. But all good, and the app is good, and it's, as we keep mentioning, it's a real-time app, so it's updated. And if you're looking to see what the value, I guess, or what the asking prices are and rents in any suburb in this country that has them, then you'll find it in the app. So you can move through Graeme's entity to find that. So it's all good, Graeme.
Beautiful. Thanks, Doc. Have a great week.
You too, mate. See ya.
Bye.